Hello, everybody, and welcome along. It is the evening of the 15th of March, 2025, and we come to you with a live stream on the subject of Kursk hyphen another British slaughterhouse. Now, this is, of course, a reference to the fact that the Kursk incursion is coming to a close. And a very bloody conclusion it is too. So we're going to be looking at that tonight. But first, we will begin with a series of interesting quotations. First of all, here's Niccolo Machiavelli on the subject of betrayal. It cannot be called ingenuity to kill one's fellow citizens, to betray friends, to be without faith, without mercy, without religion. By these means, one can acquire power, but not glory. Of that quote more later on. Here is Dante from the Inferno, of Inferno fame, I should say. And in the Dante reserved the lowest circle of hell for those he describes as traitors and betrayers. And in the lowest circle of hell, there lie the free people who Dante regarded as the lowest and most despicable examples of traitors, the greatest traitors in human history, as viewed by him, which were as follows: Judas, Brutus, and Cassius. Dante says the following: "That soul there which has the worst punishment is Judas Iscariot, my master said, with his head inside and kicking his legs. Of the other two who hang from the black face is Brutus. See how he twists and says not a word. And the other is Cassius, whose body looks so heavy. The punishment for Judas, Brutus, and Cassius is to be chewed in perpetuity by Satan," which is quite some image. There's nobody quite like the Catholics for the, shall we say, conjuring up a visceral set of images. Now, final thing I want to read to you for now is the announcement on Radio Milano Liberta from 1945 regarding a certain Italian gentleman of a fascist disposition. This reads as follows: "The head of this association of delinquents, Mussolini, while yellow with rancor and fear and trying to cross the Swiss frontier, has been arrested. He must be handed over to a tribunal of the people so it can judge him quickly. We want this, even though we think an execution platoon is too much of an honor for this man. He would deserve to be killed like a mangy dog." I would just say there that is the only words to disagree with there are the idea that Mussolini should be compared to a mangy dog. Most mangy dogs are quite harmless creatures. Mussolini was one of the most lowest and miserable criminals of the 20th century, who reduced the country that he was always banging on about in terms of glory to almost to a complete ruin, as did, of course, the drugged up, ballless lunatic Hitler reduced Germany to rubble. More on them later. But why am I reading out quotes from Dante and Machiavelli to start this particular broadcast? Is it because I like the idea of a bit of dramatic a bit of a dramatic quote to start off with? Well, maybe. But the subject of betrayal and traitors is, of course, close to tonight's subject in hand, which is, of course, the Kursk incursion. Now, the Kursk incursion began all the way back in August of last year, and it has gone on for now over half a year. And according to the Russian Ministry of Defense, who publish regular summaries of these things, the Kursk incursion has cost the NATO side, because it's always very important to say it's the NATO side. It's mostly Ukrainians doing the dying, but there's plenty of NATO quote-unquote mercenaries in the mix. And the total of casualties and losses of vehicles is claimed to be by the Russians along the following lines: more than 67,630 troops killed since the beginning of the Kursk incursion back in August of last year, 393 tanks destroyed, 317 infantry fighting vehicles, 283 armoured personnel carriers, 2,199 armoured fighting vehicles, 2,437 motor vehicles, 555 artillery pieces, 52 multiple launch rocket systems, including 13 HIMARS and 7 MLRS, all made in USA, 26 anti-aircraft missile launchers, 1 self-propelled anti-aircraft system, 10 transport loading vehicles, 120 electronic warfare stations, 16 counter-battery warfare radars, 10 air defense radars, 56 units of engineering and other material, including 23 counter-obstacle vehicles, 1 UR-77 mine-clearing vehicle, 5 bridge launchers, 1 engineering reconnaissance vehicle, as well as 15 armored recovery vehicles, and 1 mobile command post. So, now, even if you take the claims made by the Russian Ministry of Defense to be somewhat over the top, though it must be said that their claims of a roughly 10-to-1 kill ratio that they've stuck to at various different points have usually proved to be far more accurate than anything coming out of the NATO side. So let's just think about that for a moment. If we take let's just assume that this is say that this is correct. 67,630 men dead. So that's what in August, September, October, November, December, January, February. That's almost 10,000 men a month killed in this incursion into Kursk. So that is a phenomenally high casualty rate, and it's been claimed in numerous times by people who observe this from, if not the pro-Russian standpoint, then the anti-NATO standpoint, that the Kursk incursion was actually meant to be a rapid raid to seize the Kursk nuclear power plant, to then barter that off with the Russians, or to increase the pressure on the Russian government. The idea being that this would cause some kind of split at the top, and the cherished aim of the US and British imperialists would be realized, which is that Putin would the Putin government would implode, and it would be all over. The issue is, though, that of course none of this happened. They weren't able to seize the Kursk nuclear power plant. They weren't able to get anywhere near it. In actual fact, they weren't able to get near key Russian Ministry of Defense installations. In fact, the whole thing turned into a giant slaughterhouse, which the Ukrainians could not or would not leave. Now, then we go back to the point about why are we talking about Dante and Machiavelli and Mussolini? Well, we're talking about them because the ninth circle of hell, the frozen wastes of it, being reserved for the most despicable variety of human being, as Dante saw it, the traitor, the betrayer. Well, that's how we should regard the wretched creature known as Vladimir Alexandrovich Zelensky, a man who is, the more he is portrayed in the British and Western press as some sort of hero, the more one should dive into his actual track record. And it is upon the head of Vladimir Alexandrovich Zelensky that the 67,000 dead men in Kursk and many more across the course of this entire war, now into its 4th year, that it is upon his head that these deaths deserve to be placed. For it is Zelensky who has masterminded this whole affair. It is Zelensky who carries out dutifully his orders from mainly London and to a slightly different extent Washington. It is Zelensky who is the man who fronts this up. It is Zelensky who continues to have the press gangs trawl the streets, although one of the prominent press gang men was killed just this week in Odessa. But the press gangs still trawl the streets, grabbing every Ukrainian man they can possibly find and packing him off to die in large numbers with no sign to mark where, to quote the Pogues. To die for what? Is it the glory of Ukraine? No, of course it's not. It's the attempts at economic revival of the foul and noxious vampire-like entities known as British and American imperialism. That is what the Ukrainian outsourced army is being asked to die for, and is dying in huger numbers every single day. And the Kursk incursion is another British slaughterhouse, because it is almost certain that most of the planning for this was done by the British. It's one of their classic operations. In fact, just as the Krinky disaster was a British plan, this more than likely is a British plan. And it has all the hallmarks of it, in that it was absurdly overambitious, based on no real understanding of the disposition of forces, and was in reality something that was deeply, deeply cynical, and was only ever meant to be something that appeared to be a victory, and not a real victory, of course. The Ukrainians were led to their deaths on completely false premises, as this whole war has been conducted on a completely false basis by the Ukrainian comprador regime. And that is why, of course, we begin the show with quotes from Dante and Machiavelli, and with the talk of Mussolini, because this is what compradors are: the arch betrayers, the worst kind of traitors, who hide their treasons behind loud proclamations of tub-thumping petty nationalism, who scream and shout about honor and nation and dignity and independence and sovereignty, when in reality they've relentlessly surrendered all of the above, and have done ever since Ukraine achieved its, well, nominal independence in 1991. Every single character who has ruled Ukraine, all of the foul and noxious beings known as the Ukrainian capitalist class, all that they have done is to sell the nation for pennies on the dollar to the US, the British, the French, the Dutch, and others. Sell its resources, sell its land, sell it, asset strip its industrial base, destroy any possibility that it could be an independent state, even on the basis that something like a place like Belarus is an independent state. Reduce it to the status of utter penury, then sell the whole place, including its people, to the British and the US. Because that's what all these people have done. Going all the way back to Kravchuk, then Kushma, then, of course, Yushchenko, then Poroshenko, and now Zelensky. All of these people deserve to be in Dante's lowest circle, being chewed by Satan for all eternity, if that is indeed your choice of theology. But why not play with that image a little while longer? Why shouldn't it be that Kravchuk and Kushma and Poroshenko be in the mouth of Satan for eternity, being chewed like Brutus, Cassius, and Judas for what they have done to Ukraine? Because it is men like them upon whose shoulders the blame must be laid. It is men like them who lied relentlessly to the Ukrainian masses, who sold the country inch by inch and pound by pound to the US and the British, principally the US and the British. So we mustn't forget that the French and the Germans and the Dutch have been in the mix as well, as have the Norwegians. Everybody forgets that they are an imperialist power, but indeed they are. And now we are faced with this. Now we are faced with this horror that they have committed, having allowed their nation to be sold, having handed over control of it completely to the US imperialists and the Europeans, principally the British and the French, with the Germans playing a role as well, their usual despicable, yellow, and cowardly role. They have then turned this country into a giant outsourced army, commanded really from London and Washington and partially from Brussels. They have allowed the Ukrainian men to be marched off in large numbers to the slaughter, with a level of casualties that easily matches some of the worst battlefields of World War I. And make no mistake, if you're watching this in an imperialist country, the only thing that's really holding them back from doing the same thing to us and trying to march us off down to the Donbass to face the same level of slaughter and madness as the poor Ukrainians have done, is the fact that they are still afraid that if they tried to do the same thing here, that there would be some kind of domestic revolt. It's that which stops them, that and other practicalities such as the complete lack of an industrial base, which they, the ruling class themselves, have completely hollowed out. But do not think for a moment, if any of you are deluded enough to think that the people who own this country give one single solitary shit about your life, that they would actually preserve you, that they would actually take the idea of preserving the sacred life of the holder of a British passport any more seriously than they would the life of a Ukrainian. No, they would not. When push comes to shove, that is what they will do if they are desperate enough, and they are getting desperate enough. This is why the Kursk incursion was licensed. This is why they will not allow the war to end. I will repeat that. They will not allow the war to end. Not the British, not the French, not the Germans, not the Italians, not the Spanish, and not the US either. The plan of Trump, whatever it is today, this week, this hour, this minute, this second, this microsecond, because it seems to change a lot, is not to actually end the war. It is to extricate the US from it and rebrand the war as a European operation. Thus, the war will continue. The US will try and do its deal separately with the Russians. There will be no peace. Zelensky will be told that if he wishes to preserve his own hide, then he'd better carry on with the war no matter what. And he will. And there will be more Kursks. And there will be more failed offensives. And there will be more gigantic piles of corpses mounting and mounting. Until finally, of course, Zelensky is either forced to flee by the advancing Russian forces, or, and this would be my preferred outcome, he is drawn into a reckoning with those who he has sinned the most against, just as Mussolini was. Just as Mussolini was eventually captured by those who he had sought to annihilate physically, that is, the communists, and had justice delivered to him in the form of a swift execution. That is the only outcome which Vladimir Alexandrovich Zelensky actually deserves. Because, as I say, once that he has sold the Ukrainian nation, though in complete fairness, we should say that Zelensky is not the only man who sold the Ukrainian nation. I mean, as I said, there are others who are guilty men as well. But the point about Zelensky is that, of course, he is held up as this great hero, as a Churchillian figure. Though I would say that, of course, Churchill at least was in command, relatively speaking, far more in command of his own destiny than Zelensky is. Zelensky is just an employee. Ultimately, Churchill was as well, but a far more important one, a direct employee of the British ruling class. Zelensky is an outsourced regional manager working in, shall we say, a hostile business environment, trying to grow the market share of his British employers in very difficult conditions, and has been cutting all kinds of corners in order to deliver upon the objectives that he has been set. And this is, of course, the situation that is now facing Ukraine. Again, I will emphasize the point. The reason why you have this 30-day truce thing, which we discussed on the episode of Decline and Fall the other day, is because, of course, the imperialists want to try and pull off some kind of trick. They want to put down the idea of a 30-day truce. They will try and impose conditions which the Russians cannot possibly accept. When the Russians do not accept it, they will, of course, try to then say, oh, well, Russia's against peace, therefore, everybody please turn on Russia now. And, of course, that will not happen. It will not work. There's too much water and, indeed, blood flowing under this particular bridge for now. So, what of the fate of Zelensky? Well, as I say, the only thing that we can hope for is that the best thing we can hope for is that he is disposed of in some kind of internal revolt inside Ukraine itself. But I unfortunately doubt that that will happen. What will ultimately occur now is that the European sponsors of Ukraine will find some way to compel the war onwards, to tell Zelensky that he must absolutely stay in place. They can't risk elections. They can't risk a change of power in Kiev, because this war, as in any war, depends largely upon momentum. I mean, there's a talk of the Americans have some sort of plan to replace Zelensky. That will, in the end, I think, be shelved. I think it will be a non-starter, because if you change the guard in the Kiev regime, change the region, or shall we say, swap out one failing regional manager for another. I mean, is it going to be the pimp Klitschko? Is it going to be the lard bucket general Zaluzny? Is it going to be some other pet fascist of the Americans? Who knows? But either way, changing over in the middle of a war is a very, very risky thing to try. And if the US tries to do that, there is a distinct risk that the whole thing may fall to pieces, given that it is only held together with US and European and British money and a ever-growing supply of weaponry, as you would have seen or heard rather from that list that the Russian Ministry of Defense claimed to have destroyed. The Zelensky gang have now burnt through thousands upon thousands of armored vehicles and tanks and other weapon systems that cannot possibly be replaced with the current level of production from the US or Europe. So the Zelensky gang need to find some way out of this, or more to the point, his employers do, which is why you've got this idea floating around in German and French and British circles of basically calming the war down for 5 years or so. But there was talk from those surrounding Friedrich Merz, the new chancellor to be of Germany, that they were going to need 5 years to upscale production before they can relaunch the war. Now, if you think of the tremendous cynicism and brutality of that, like Ukraine, a country which has been destroyed by its own comprador, wretched ruling class, in the service of the EU nations, Germany, France, the Dutch, etc., the British as well, and the US. And Merz's idea, Herr Blackrock, I should say, or perhaps Herr Schwarzrock, you should say. His idea is, or the idea of those surrounding him, is to essentially keep a lower level of a war going, or find some sort of get the Russians to agree to some sort of pause, and then once you've rearmed and built up Ukraine again, then relaunch the war. So march more Ukrainians off to the slaughter. This is disgusting on every single conceivable level. It is disgusting. There is no other word for it. And the deaths of these Ukrainians, of course, but the principal responsibility lies with the Ukrainian comprador bourgeoisie and their employees, Poroshenko, Zelensky, and others. But it's also something which deserves to be laid upon, at the door of the imperialists, of course. They are the ones who are ultimately setting the agenda here. And it also deserves to be laid at our feet, those of us in the imperialist countries. Let's make no mistake about it. Those who, like a certain Paul Mason and many others, who have been screaming and banging the drum for the great Zelensky, the great heroic defender of Ukraine, all of these people are, of course, disgusting propagandists, but ultimately, everything they do is the opposite of what they say. They say they are defending an independent and sovereign Ukraine. They are not. They are defending a slave state that has been not only reduced to the status of being essentially a blood bank for the vampiric British and American ruling classes, but also a center of various different organized crime and mafia operations. Mafia operations in the sense that you have the center of sex trafficking there, as is evidenced by the Ukrainian exiled journalist Diana Panchenko and her investigation into Klitschko, mayor of Kiev, and pimp, as it turns out. He's a far more developed pimping operation than the likes of course, the Tate brothers, though perhaps they share a client list. You also have a center of course, weapons smuggling running out of there, and also a center of organ harvesting and organ trafficking. This is the same collection of mafioso that emerge in every single US puppet state. If you go back 15 years or so, similar thing was being said of, and is still reported about, Kosovo. Kosovo became a sex trafficking center, an organ trafficking center, a people trafficking center, a drug dealing operation. Every mafia you could think of was operating out of there, because that was who the fake state or statelet or puppet state was handed over to by the imperialists. That's who the KLA were. Mafia types, organized crime, lumpens, criminals, the worst kind of scum you could possibly imagine. Who do you think is in charge of Syria right now? Who do you think Giuliani is, or whatever his real name is? Al-Sharaa. Dave from Birkenhead. I don't know. Could be anybody. He's just been declared president. And it's rather telling that they've restored the flag of French mandate Syria. Because again, this is who the country has been handed over to as a regional management team by imperialism. Criminals, lumpens, scum of the lowest possible kind, murderers, serial killers, rapists, gangsters, drug dealers. This is the kind of people who run all of these different US puppet states. These are the kind of people that run them, the lowest of the low, because that's who works for US and British imperialism. Literally the lowest of the low, who later have their reputations laundered by the official stenographers of empire. Who do you think Lawrence of Arabia had on his side back in the day? Plenty of them were the lowest of the low as well, and there's plenty of British intelligence agents who see old Lawrence as a real model for their particular operations. And to go back to Ukraine, so that it should not be a surprise at all that you get a mafia operation running this country and sacrificing hundreds and hundreds of thousands of men on the orders of their bosses in London and Washington, or that you get Syria reduced to a sectarian bloody nightmare by the gangs that took it over. Again, this is the same type of people who broke up Yugoslavia with the assistance of the imperialists as a result of the failure and the feebleness of the Titoites. This is why, ultimately, and here it comes back to the point we always make here, why the dictatorship of the proletariat has to be and must be in the future absolutely ruthlessly enforced. Because this is who the counter-revolutionaries are. They'll stick all kinds of faces on them. They'll stick a socialist face on it. They did indeed with the counter-revolutionaries in the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc for a while. They'll stick a liberal face on it. They'll stick a feminist face on it. They'll stick a multiculturalist face on it. Anything you want. But this is who the muscle is. This is who the muscle was back in the day in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. This Trotsky was the face of the opposition for a time, but the muscle really came from fascists, came from counter-revolutionaries, came from so-called Ukrainian nationalists, who in reality aren't nationalists at all, just tattoo-fixated lunatics who sell themselves willingly to various different imperialist powers. This is who they are. And the only way to deal with them is to suppress them as ruthlessly as possible. Because if you don't do it to them, then their poison will only grow. And they will only grow bolder and more brutal, as has been seen in Syria. The biggest crime, the biggest failing of the Baathists in Syria is that they were nowhere near repressive enough. And if you want to clip that and turn it into a TikTok video, feel free to do so. Now, going back to the point about the wretched regime in Ukraine and its fate. This is what happens. This is the end of the counter-revolutionaries who seized power in Ukraine in the late 80s with the assistance of another miserable scumbag who should have been dragged out of the Kremlin and shot dead in Red Square with a bullet through his baldy fucking head, Gorbachev. This is the kind of people who are enabled by the counter-revolution. This is the kind of people who are enabled by socialism with a so-called human face. And people ask, oh, why is it that the socialism cannot come without purges? Well, this is why. This is why. You don't get to win without cleansing the scum, basically. You don't get to build socialism except by ruthlessly eliminating the counter-revolution, including, of course, eliminating imperialism itself. But that, of course, cannot be done from the outside. That must be done from the inside. So if you're watching this in Britain or the US tonight, let us all just take a collective admission of guilt, because we are guilty. No two ways about it. We are guilty. We're guilty of cowardice. We're guilty of complacency. We're guilty of shrugging our shoulders, of saying there's nothing I can do, or there's nothing I'm prepared to do. And the biggest guilt of all belongs to the leaders of the fake anti-war organizations, like those who are marching around carrying on pretentiously in London today, proclaiming themselves to be the great leaders of something. In reality, the so-called anti-war movements over the last 20 years have not only not stopped wars, They have led those of us who have participated in them down a series of blind alleys. And in the case of Ukraine, they have barely even registered anything, despite the appalling crimes committed by British imperialism and its Ukrainian regional management team in Ukraine. The so-called anti-war movement has not moved at all when it comes to Ukraine, despite the facts of British involvement being admitted to, even in the bourgeois press. Can you get the leaders, the great leaders of the anti-war movement in Britain to move? Can you get them to acknowledge the truth of what the British ruling class has been doing in Ukraine? No, you cannot. They continue to repeat and parrot the same lies told by the British ruling class themselves. They all line up behind, ultimately, the lies of the ruling class. Why? Why is it that they still line up behind the lies of the ruling class? Well, if you want a full and thorough explanation of that, go back and revisit the video I did on the social democratic betrayals over Ukraine. But I'll summarize here. Social democracy, which is what dominates the left and is the left, really, in all of the imperialist countries, is an appendage of the ruling class. It was set up to administer concessions after World War II in its current incarnation, having already sold the working class to the ruling class in World War I. It then did the same job for them again, but by administering a certain number of concessions after World War II. So social democracy, they know damn well, the leaders of it, that is, that any of their programs depend upon imperialism really being successful for them to receive anything. That is the nature of the beast here. The concessions that were administered after World War II were funded by the rape of the colonized nations. That is the grim truth. And what is also the grim truth is that by accepting those concessions and being bought off, the working class in the West injected poison into its own veins, a slow creeping paralysis that is known as social democracy, a deference to authority, a refusal to take the revolutionary road, or an incapacity to take the revolutionary road because all the communist parties in the West sold out as well. And so this is what you get. You get the revolutionary tide ebbs. You get a working class which emerges, which is incapable of struggle because it's not politically educated. It looks upwards towards its elected representatives in the bourgeois system perennially for some kind of renewal of welfare capitalism, and none ever comes. And you get leaders who are collaborators with imperialism, because that's what the bulk of the groups inside Britain today, inside the US and inside France are. They are collaborators with imperialism. They are collaborators with the death machine. They are the people who mislead those of us who were wanting to actually genuinely stop the wars, who did want to get active, and lead us all down a blind alley over and over and over again. So the disgusting crimes of the British ruling class in Ukraine are partly our fault, just as the disgusting crimes of the British ruling class and their employee, Giuliani and his friends, in Syria are partly our fault, just as the war in Yugoslavia is partly our fault, because we didn't do enough, because we allowed the leadership of so-called anti-war organizations to be in the hands of social democrats and Khrushchevite revisionists and Trotskyites who repeat all the lies of the ruling class and are ultimately really employees of the ruling class. And it's also our fault because too many of us didn't realize this. Too many of us leant back on the legacies of welfare capitalism, wanting desperately for it to return. Whether we knew that that was what we were doing or not, we're still stuck there. We're still floating around this sewer, thinking that it's a river to paradise. It is most definitely not. The poison in the veins that was delivered in 1945 is still acting upon us. And it is holding us back from ever doing anything effective ever again. And until we realize that ultimately the concessions of 1945 were fatal, short-term gain, long-term catastrophic loss, not just for us, of course, but for all of the countries in the world that have been looted and ransacked by British imperialism, while British leftists trail around the streets chanting welfare, not warfare, or some other absolutely idiotic slogan, ignoring, of course, where all the money comes from. Where does the money come from for the British state to make any concession? It doesn't come from productive use of capital in Britain anymore, comes from parasitism, pure parasitism. And that is what is being done in Ukraine right now. That is what is in play. The parasitism of British imperialism, this fading and degenerated state, clinging on and sucking the lifeblood out of other nations, whilst the leaders of the so-called left inside this rotting imperial carcass continue to pretend that that isn't where the money comes from. But it is. And make no mistake about it, that this, if one is a believer in divine judgment, which I am not, I'm a believer ultimately in the judgment of the masses. But the judgment of the masses in the end, even in the imperial core countries, will be absolutely damning to those who pretended that this was a situation which could be redeemed through reforms, who pretended that you could vote your way to socialism in the imperial core nations, who pretended and lied about where the money for the reforms was going to come from. Because a lot of these people know, a lot of these people understand it very well, and they understand their role. And until we reckon with the fact that the only thing you can do with British imperialism is ultimately organize to destroy it, that is the only thing that you can do. If you're doing anything else, if you're pretending that you can win in any other way, then you are lying to yourself and you are lying to the masses. You can fight for reforms here and there, yes, most certainly. But the aim of any fight for reforms is to expose, in the eyes of the masses, the fact that the system is too rotten and too diseased and too decayed to be saved, and you cannot do anything with it. And if you do try, those who do try to involve themselves in reform programs, those who do take that seriously, end up becoming a slave to British imperialism, which is exactly what is being done by so many social democrats, some of whom entered the system with perhaps sincere intentions over the years. They all end up exactly where all the social democrats ended up the other day, all saying, we support Keir Starmer's Ukraine war policy, because again, that's where the money comes from. That's why 67,000 Ukrainians have been sent to their deaths in the Kursk incursion. That's why apparently there's been over 1 million casualties in the last 3 years, because it's to try and support the imperialist system, which seeks to revive itself, not by consuming Ukraine, that's already been done, that's a small prize, but ultimately by consuming Russia and ultimately China. That's what they want to do. Ukraine is just a tool for them, a means to an end, a brutally cynical policy, which should be relentlessly exposed before the masses, and we should bring home to the masses in Britain and elsewhere that unless we take action, organize ourselves properly to overthrow this system, in the end, it will consume us too. And it is already consuming millions of working class people in this country. It is already sucking their lifeblood dry. And ultimately, it is the labor aristocracy who dominate the so-called working class organizations, who cling on to the illusions about voting, the illusions about parliament, the illusions about trade unionism. Well, it's time to shed all of them. Because ultimately what British imperialism's continued existence means is millions of dead on the battlefields of Ukraine, and many millions more unless this is stopped, because they will do the same thing with regard to China. They will push other nations into a proxy war with the Chinese. They won't fight it themselves. They're too cowardly, too pathetic, and too rotten to do it themselves. They'll try and get Filipinos to die for them, or Taiwanese to die for them, or many other nationalities to die for them. They'll find some comprador scum and put him in charge and get him to do it, just like they found Zelensky. And so this is a warning for all of us. Unless we act against imperialism, in the end, it will degenerate to the point where it will revert to fascism and try to devour us. And so the only thing you can do with such a wretched state of affairs, the only thing that you can do against such a ruling class, which is just, again, a vampiric, parasitic group which needs to be destroyed, the only thing you can do, really, is to follow Lenin's advice. Smash the state, smash their state, build our own, and then ruthlessly expropriate all of their ill-gotten gains, and throw every single member of the ruling class and their most immediate servants into a prison for the longest of times, at the very least. If this is not done, then more and more people will die as this ruling class attempts to preserve itself, including many workers in this country itself. Or make no mistake, everything they visit upon Ukraine now will be visited upon us in the end, unless something changes. All right, okay. Yes, I see we've got an idiot in the chat. Right, we'll come to you later. Okay, so we are 39 minutes in. We have 262 of you watching on Twitch and YouTube. I don't know what's up with the Rumble stream, but be sure to go on to that if you haven't done so already. Right, let's have a look here. See how many of you have we got on X or Twitter, if you prefer. 246 of you, all good stuff. Thank you for joining tonight. So, hello to Ash, who joins us from Down Under, saying the media narrative down under is Russia struggles to take Kursk. Yes. The usual lies. Good evening to Tim Gray and Just a Maverick and Almir from Slovenia, the once and future socialist Yugoslavia, and to Enigma, Alexander Lukta, Tom Wall says Starmer is going to stick with Ukraine at the same time cutting $6 billion from disabled people. Total disgrace. Well, Tom, you're correct. I would say, though, that whilst that is a good agitational point to be made and indeed must be made, we must also always explain to people just exactly what, as I said, where the money comes from for the concessions, which is that they're not going to take it off the ruling class. Any concession that gets made is going to get funded via robbing somebody else. And yes, you're right. I mean, this $6 billion from disabled people, it's going to be a drop in the fucking ocean, really. It's not going to revive the British industrial base. All of this stuff that they're talking about now is it's just wind out of Starmer's flapping pig offal strewn gob. He can't fulfill any of these things. He can't actually revive the British industrial base, not without reducing the British working class to absolutely abject slavery. But who knows? He may try it, or Wes Streeting might try it, or Nigel Farage might try it. Okay. But yes, you are correct in that the $6 billion taken from the disabled is going to have a big impact upon those it is taken from. And in the end, not trying to go down the melodramatic route, but when people ask, well, how could it happen that Hitler killed, or the Nazis, I should say, killed so many disabled people and so many who were regarded as inferior? Well, the Nazis is just the most extreme expression of the logic of the system. And the logic of capital is that, well, if we can't make money off you, there's no point in you being alive. And that's why disabled people are sacrificed in this way. It's not quite a gas chamber, but it will be death for many, as you are correctly pointing out. Alexander Lukta says, one thing you can give to Mussolini's fascism is that it was not as stiff and not anti-Semitic in the beginning. Funnily, he found the Fuhrer pretty ridiculous at first. A copycat then became his lapdog. Well, Germany was the much more powerful imperialist country, so it was always going to be the case that a fascism in Germany would be stronger. Though it should be said also that the Italian fascists were involved in funding the NSDAP from a very early stage, according to the book Who Financed Hitler. Hello to Arcane Eclectic. Hello to Albert and Agricola Urbanus and Tracy Wilkinson. Alexander Lukta says Zelensky is a mentally broken actor. He is between the right-wing military and Western instigators. He's scared for his life. Well, you want the job, you got to accept the consequences. And the consequences are basically now he could have taken a risk in going before the Ukrainian people and explaining the situation to them, but he has chosen to try and save his own miserable skin and escape to a villa in Miami or somewhere. Maybe he will, maybe he won't. Arcane Eclectic says mandatory conscription in a Western country would bring down the government in a matter of months. It would, as soon as the grim realities took hold. It's why they haven't done it, by the way. It's why they got rid of it 60 years ago in this country. because they were afraid of what would happen if they did engage in a war where there was like massive conscripted soldiers were being killed. It would be hard to maintain. I mean, look what happened with the U.S. 50 odd thousand dead in Vietnam over a decade long period. In fact, the earliest casualties were back in the 50s, but it was so these were by no means like it's a sizable number, but spread over like 3 decades from the 50s to the 70s. It's not gigantic, but they couldn't sustain that level of casualties, even in the period when U.S. welfare capitalism was at its height. Problem for the imperialists now is they're going to try and conscript a bunch of people into an army whilst offering them absolutely nothing. I mean, these aren't the days of the early 19th century, but even back then there were military revolts when they tried to conscript people, and also the ruling class was always nervous of doing so. So they're in a really sticky situation, to say the least. We will not be led to slaughter by the billionaire class. Well, let's hope not. But again, and I'm not aiming this at you specifically, Arcane Eclectic. Your sentiment is entirely correct, but it's not enough just to say it. You need to make it a reality. And that therein, of course, lies a problem. Albert says Zelensky is the new Churchill. It's like Starmer and Lammy. Well, I think Starmer wants to be the new Tony Blair, but he's not quite that good an actor. Ash says Australia's PM, Albanese, says he stands with Ukraine. We do have a federal election coming up in a few months, and Labour needs to shore up their petty bourgeois base. Yes, nobody more deluded and rancid than the Anglo petty bourgeoisie. Hello to Holistic Politics and Mo 1917. Alexander Lukter says, Rheinmetall said since Volkswagen moved production abroad, they could use the shutdown factories to produce tanks. The Heimat front is mobilizing. I think Caustic Grit replies well to that, which is that it's not going to be just a matter of like flipping a switch and then the production line changes to tank production. Rheinmetall will be asking for the German state to cover all costs, of course, which will be paid for, they hope, the Merz hopes, by selling off assets and attacking the conditions of the German working class. And we'll see what kind of a response that brings. Just a Maverick says projection is the number one tactic of the fascist. You could say it's their trademark. Yes, the fascist always screams that the leftists, the communists, are selling the nation to the nation's enemies, because that is exactly what the fascist is always doing. The fascist is always selling the country to the highest bidder. This is also true of the Hitlerites. The Hitlerites were making sure that Germany's debt got paid to the US, even up to and including the period of the war. So this is the thing with all the fascists. It's always the same. It's always screaming about the nation, whereas in reality, they're just the most violent and brutish expression of the power of the ruling class. That's what fascism always is. It's big on aesthetics and big on absurd nationalistic romantic imagery, which is always completely divorced from material conditions. Because if you examine the actual record of the fascists, be they in Italy, in Germany, or Spain, what you'll find is just that, again, the crudest and most violent expression of the most rabid end of the ruling class. T.G. Wilson says the most tragic element is that it is the working class who have lacked the class consciousness due to imperialist programming to fight this war rather than overthrow the Ukrainian fascists. Yeah, and it's not just in recent years. I mean, this goes all the way back to the treachery of the Khrushchevites, who ideologically disarmed the Soviet working class over many, many years as they turned to revisionism and then to outright capitalist restoration. They did so by disarming the Soviet working class and reducing its ability to fight, so that the Soviet peoples, who had heroically seen off the Hitlerites, couldn't see off a miserable traitor like Gorbachev when he came along. That was the product of 30 plus years of ideological backsliding on behalf of the Khrushchevite revisionists, of deliberately retarding the class consciousness of the Soviet worker to the point where they were unable to resist the capitalist restoration, despite the fact that the great bulk of them, the overwhelming majority of them, didn't want it. And that terrible legacy continued to plague the bulk of the working class in places like Ukraine for years and years afterwards. Maybe it'll change now, but my God, what a price that has ultimately been paid for the treacheries of Khrushchev, Gorbachev, and many, many others. Keel Jones says George Galloway gave a tongue bath to the Tate brothers. Super weird. Well, that's one of the weirdest things I've ever fucking seen. Mr. Law and Order, Mr. I believe in good old-fashioned British justice. Giving a fucking, a glorious welcome to two pimps, basically, to two fucking sex offenders, which is what those two are. The Tate brothers are a pair of sex offenders. And yet you find people wanting to give them the time of day. Quite what Galloway's motivations were, I don't know. You'd have to ask him. I would ask him, but he's still got me blocked. Agricola Urbana says the most class-conscious element in Ukraine was the Donbass, even before the putsch. Yes, exactly. And that is exactly why resistance emerged there. Yes, it was tied to the idea of wanting to join Russia, but it was the most class-conscious and militant aspect of the Ukrainian, as it was back then, working class who carried out the resistance, who formed the core of the Donbass militias, and who ultimately forced the change of policy inside Russia itself, forced the Russian bourgeois government to come out and fight. If it weren't for them and their resistance, then the war would not be what it is today. And maybe the imperialists might have been able to succeed in their initial aims. It is forever to the credit of the working class of the Donbass and Crimea that they resisted in the way that they did and carried on that war for 8 long years before finally the Russian government was pressured into moving. And so those people deserve to be remembered as anti-imperialist heroes. They did the fighting that at the time the Russian government could not agree a consensus position to join, and desperately still tried to make deals with the imperialists. In the end, they were forced to follow the heroic example of the Donbass militias and join the war. And this is the result. Almir says Russia is aware of the state of Ukrainian armed forces. They also know about the limits of the Western industry. That's true. Keel Jones says the West loves old Gorby. Well, why wouldn't they? He gave them their victory, or he was part of what gave them their victory. Though really, they should include Khrushchev in their fulsome tributes. And after all, there's no Gorbachev without a Khrushchev. G.G. Wilson says Zelensky needs to meet a modern Walter Odizio. That's yes. Agricola Urbana says, I see no significant opposition from the New Left if they would even dare to speak the truth about the conflict, but even in everyday life, as difficult as during COVID to discuss the war. Yes, well, there's a reason why that is. There's a reason why the propaganda over Ukraine is so intense and insane. It is because it is so absolutely crucial for the ruling class. There's been a full court press on the propaganda on this one, precisely because the ruling class have been absolutely aware of the need to win this thing. They need to break up and loot Russia. And if they don't get that, then there's going to be an even more severe crisis in the system very, very soon, which might lead to the threats to their own position. And so that's why it's in absolutely all hands to the pump, and they've been lining up every single one of the wretched social democrats in the imperial core countries to back them up on this. Zain Mudassir says anti-war movement is controlled opposition. That's true. Let's carry on. Okay, so we've got the usual fascist idiot in the chat. It says that the City of London controlled Karl Marx, etc., etc., etc. Yeah, well, you know what? The truth of your claims is in the is in the evidence provided to us by history, and the British ruling class have killed tens of millions in order to try and destroy communism since 1917. They funded the white armies in Russia, which killed many millions of Russian workers and peasants in order to drown the Soviet Republic in blood. They killed many Indian communists in the early stages of the modern Indian independence movement. They killed thousands and thousands of communists and associated allies of theirs in Malaysia. They killed or helped the US and CIA, etc., kill millions to wipe out the Indonesian Communist Party. So it's a pretty fucking funny thing, isn't it? Where you apparently control communism, so therefore you kill millions and millions of your own employees. Right down, and in a way that they don't do with anybody else, with any other force. The British ruling class have always been absolutely brutal as any fascist regime, in destroying and uprooting communism wherever they find it. Certainly in the colonized nations. So, a bit of a funny thing to do that if you're employing them. Pull your head out your fucking ass, unless you are just some paid hack. What's your fucking name? Obi Vittel. Like, this is like absolute fucking infant school shit. In fact, no, that's an insult to infants. This is like fucking Jeffrey Archer novel shit. It doesn't make any fucking sense at all. But then again, why would I be surprised with some dickhead who's quoting Rolling Stones lyrics and thinking that he's fucking deep? But then again, I shouldn't be surprised. Culture in the West is about as deep as a puddle. Somebody can come up to you and quote Beatles lyrics in a bar, and then look at you as if he's saying something profoundly fucking deep and meaningful, man. Yeah. Hey, have you ever considered that all you need is love? Fuck me, I hadn't considered that before. Thanks, Paul McCartney. But this is the state of the Western world. This is the state of its culture. You get people who are cosplaying as fascists online, who are pretending to be something, as pretending to be something deep, when in actual fact they have the political knowledge of the back of a fucking beer mat. So if you haven't been banned already, please take yourself to the nearest exit and follow one of your loser idols, Mussolini, out of the door. So, Agricola Urbana says, it is disheartening how many young Muslims here cheer on the HTS and claim Syria is now liberated while still wearing Palestine flags. They cheer on the Mossad and the CIA thugs. I find it hard to unite. Well, they're not the only ones, are they? I mean, look, these younger end have been raised. I mean, first of all, let's just make it clear. Very easy to the further away you are from a place, the easier it is to cheer on its destruction and claim its liberation. The biggest militant Ukrainians are in America. They're in Canada. They're in Germany, and they're not going back. They're not volunteering to go and fight and die in what's left of the Kursk incursion or in Donbass. They're not doing that. Why would they? Same with these Syrian guys, or people who were born to Syrian parents running around waving an HTS flag. Like, these guys' heads have been filled with shit by maybe partially their parents, partially the bourgeois press, but they're not going back to Syria. Of course not. They're German now. And you see people saying, oh, these people don't fit in with Western civilization. They fit perfectly with it. Why don't they fit with it? They're the most enthusiastic supporters of imperialism. And they fit perfectly with the left as well, because the left supported the overthrow of the Ba'athist government of Syria, just as the left pulls its punches on Zionism and engages only in symbolic opposition. So these guys fit perfectly. And why wouldn't they adopt that position when, in terms of the people who have been telling the truth about the situation in Syria, there's only a tiny handful of us? And I direct all my criticisms, as usual, at my previous self, because I was talking shit about Syria and didn't understand a damn thing about it, saying, oh, I back the Kurds, etc., not understanding the role they were playing. I was doing all those stupid things until a few years ago. So it's like these Syrian guys, well, they're absolutely reflective of the country they grew up in. Okay. Ah, yes. Maybe you're a Russian monarchist. Mr. Rolling Stone's lyrics are very, very deep, man. Okay. Glad Stig Pedersen thinks that this talk is a good one. Well, people say that I do the best work when I'm annoyed, and having read about the Kursk incursions today, I ended up getting quite annoyed. T.G. Wilson is right. If you take away one reading recommendation from this stream, it is The Foundations of Leninism by Stalin. And let's just say in passing that there are those in Britain, and not just Britain, it's everywhere, who claim that they can't or won't read theory because it's too intellectual, etc., etc. This is, of course, a curse, particularly of the British working class, as observed by Marx and Engels in the 19th century. If you're not going to actually engage seriously by reading Marxist-Leninist theory, then you will always be misled in practice. The purpose of reading the theoretical works is not just to sit there and, come up with fancy intellectual parlor games. The purpose of reading the work of Stalin or Lenin or Marx and Engels themselves or Mao or any great revolutionary thinker and leader is to use it as a guide to action, which is what they all wanted it to be, which is what they all saw it as. And if you're not theoretically educating yourself, you're just going to keep getting misled. You're going to keep being led round and round the fucking garden by these criminals, which is what the leaders of the left are. They are criminals. And I, again, direct this criticism at myself as much as anybody else, because I didn't read anything significant for years and years and years. Couldn't get into it, thought it was boring, thought it was pointless. We need action. We need action. It's one of the things we used to run around saying when we were anarchists. We need action. Okay, but what kind of action? What is the action designed to do? How are you mobilizing the masses, if indeed you are at all? Or are you just an egotist running around and screaming and pretending that you're doing something incredibly radical, whereas in actual fact you're doing jack shit, but you're making yourself feel better? Doing anything in this time, particularly in the imperial core nations, is going to be tremendously difficult, long-lasting work, which is going to take a very significant amount of time before we will see any benefits from it, unless, of course, the situation degenerates rapidly and we need to move quicker, which, who knows, that might be coming soon. But it's taken me, certainly, a long time to realize just how bad the situation is and just how much work will need to be done to address it. Nearly 80 years of errors and opportunism needs to be overcome. At least I know what some of us know what the tasks are now, but that's a hell of a long mountain to climb, but climb it we must. There is, in the end, it's socialism or barbarism, and I have no intention of living out the rest of my life in a situation of barbarism. So there's only one choice, and the only choice to take is to engage in the struggle. And the only way to engage in the struggle is to do it wholeheartedly and throw yourself into it. No other option for any of us now. Hello to Daniel, calling in late from a break at work. Good to have you with us. Alan Smith says the logical impetus of capitalism is fundamentally anti-human and incompatible with real life. We need to convince people that a planned economy can work. Good point. Right, just scrolling through. Agricola Urbanus says Mussolini led a gassing war against Ethiopians in the mid-30s. League of Nations did nothing. Well, of course not. And it was a very worthy predecessor to the United Nations, which would also do nothing. Okay, just scrolling through. Apparently, YouTube is censoring everybody's comments but the fascists, which isn't exactly a surprise, to say the least, given that the bourgeoisie is moving more and more in the direction of fascist revivalism. Bit of an aside, asks T.G. Wilson, but wondering what's your thoughts, Alex, if you have any, on Grace Blakely's socialism. Is Grace Blakely a socialist? I'd say that she's a social democrat at best. I mean, she's a soft Keynesian, basically. Unless, of course, she's changed her position markedly in recent years. She blocked me for asking too many questions about Brexit back in the day, just like Owen Jones and John McDonnell. But basically, she's just a Labour leftist. She's going to just build castles in the sky all day about, well, wouldn't it be nice if we did this? Wouldn't it be nice if we did that? Why doesn't the Labour Party adopt my agenda? Well, because the Labour Party is just about administering capitalism and British imperialism on behalf of the ruling class, and they have no interest in your agenda, but they'll let you go around pretending that, along with many others on the left, Grace Blakely, that you can get some sort of social democratic welfare capitalist program back into the Labour Party's official policies again, which of course you can't. So Grace Blakely's job is to lie to people, because she's not stupid. She's not a stupid woman by any means. I think she understands very well the nature of the Labour Party. Maybe she doesn't quite see it in the same terms I do, but I think she understands that her agenda is never going to get adopted by Keir Starmer or indeed any Labour leader. I think she does have an understanding of Marxism. I think she seems to have read Capital, according to my knowledge of her books, but she's decided she's found an intellectual furrow to plough, and she will continue to plough it because it's a lucrative gig, and that's what people like that do. So their job is to be the permanently outvoted minority, just like her idol Saint Jeremy of Islington, pretending that something different is on offer in the Labour Party when in actual fact is not. So she's a liar and a hypocrite and a fraud, just like all the others on the Labour left. Caustic Grip says Galloway is a strange old man. Galloway is a ratings-obsessed old man. Just going through. Galloway has some red flags. He can sure turn a phrase that makes me wonder. He's an opportunist. There's no two ways about that. He's always been an opportunist. Everybody knows that. And the problem with him is that he absolutely chases the ratings, and he'll chase them anywhere, including to having sex offenders on his program. Okay, so if there's problems with YouTube censoring comments, I'd urge everybody to head over to Rumble. That apparently doesn't censor, or Twitch, or you can watch it on X. There's locals as well. There is the Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, Mao on locals, so you can get on that. Okay, just Almir says sympathy for the devil is lyrical garbage. Equating communism with Nazism, typical bourgeois art, early pre-mainstream hip-hop is much better. Well, at least the early hip-hop stuff had real poetry to it. The Rolling Stones were just rip-off artists who basically just did sort of white man versions of like US blues stuff. Again, about as deep as a fucking puddle, you know? Nihat Mere says, Turkish guy in Istanbul here. Today I saw on the streets a sad organisation attempts of lumpens, 10 plus people with no protection on the back of a truck, road building attempts in the middle of the day. So what the Turkish bourgeois is using like basic borderline slave labor, is that? Or like the low or sort of the relentless driving down of conditions is, of course, in play in Turkey. Alan Smith says, whatever happened to Rojava a few years ago? That was considered to be the only correct position in Syria by the far quote unquote left. Well, I'm not quite sure where it is at the moment, but they've done a deal with HTS and Jelani. Whether that'll ultimately save them from being dismembered by the Turkish regime is another question. Mousy says, even if you read the classics, you can still be quite misled. That's true. Look, reading all the theory doesn't necessarily make you right either. I don't want to give that impression. You can read all the theory and still be profoundly wrong because it's about the unity of theory and practice. You can still get things wrong whilst having read everything. You can read everything and completely misunderstand it. And you can be part of an organization which is not connected to the masses or not trying to. So just reading all the books isn't enough either. Just as running around and looking like you're very busy isn't enough anywhere near. Again, it's about the unification of theory and practice. With all practice and no theory, you end up like an anarchist. With all theory and no practice, you end up like Derrida, you know? So it's a delicate balancing act to get right, but get it right we must. Mm-hmm. Hello to Irish Partisan, who's just in from the pub. Okay, I'll have to find the Twitch channel, and the Twitch channel is actually still called Red Star Radio. For some reason, I think it's because I must have signed up ages ago when I was still doing the show was still called something else. So, in answer to Arcane Eclectic's question, that's where we are. Nehat Mere says, educate the youth. Today, as history is changing, we should give genuine analysis to young people and let them shape the future. We should forget our egotistical power hunger and pass it to youth. Nehat makes a good point. You should accept the fact that you may not see the revolution, but that your life is spent working to further it. And I've accepted that may well be my fate. So be it. So be it. Ash says Grace Blakely was brought on the Piers Morgan show to talk about and debate the Barbie movie. So enough said there. Well, she'll turn up if the money's good. I mean, these people in the in the petty bourgeois intelligentsia, they'll go anywhere if the money's good. Go talk to Piers Morgan about like the Barbie movie. Go make excuses for HTS. Go, make apologetics for Israel. Make apologetics for the Kiev regime. These leftist intellectuals will do it all for a few quid. Elon Cucks nuked my ex, says Jenny. That's unfortunate. Follow H. Alexandricus. Okay, we will. Mick Jagger, philosopher, says Keel Jones. Yeah, the only skill Mick Jagger really has is accountancy, and he certainly has made a lot of money. So credit where credit is due there. Okay, so we got comments coming in from Hypatia, who says, fuck YouTube. Indeed. Yeah. So, follow on Twitch, follow on Locals, follow on, I'm just going to stick the Locals link in there as well. Hang on. Just sorting this out. G.G. Wilson says, Derrida pretty much admitted he was a fraud. He borrowed from maths in the most pretentious way, once comparing the male erection to the square root of -1, the imaginary number. Total fraud. It's almost as if he was just making shit up as he went along, isn't it? Hello to Marius, who's joined us as well. Right. I'm going to bring things to a close for this evening. Thanks, everybody, for joining me. Those of you who have been censored on YouTube, I hope that you find the alternative platforms useful. If you're getting censored on YouTube, head over to the Rumble page, head over to Twitch, head over to Locals, and also head over to X. And we will be back with you again tomorrow in the evening. Program to be decided, but we will certainly be back then. I will be doing an update for the Patreon audience tomorrow. Going to be trying to make those monthly again, ASAP. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. Thanks to everybody who's tuned in today. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. And I'll be back with you again tomorrow.